name's Susanna and I'm a marketing coordinator here at Nelson Secondary. I'm just going to do a little bit of the housekeeping before we move on to our presenters for tonight's session. But thank you so much for joining us. So we're just going to start with an acknowledgement of country. So we formally do this acknowledgement to show our awareness of, whilst providing our respects to the traditional custodians. We gather today physically dispersed but virtually connected. In the spirit of reconciliation, Cengage acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And then if we jump to the next slide, just for a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded. The recording and the slides will be sent out sometime next week to everyone who's registered. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A function. This means at the end, when we go through designated question time, we won't miss any of your questions. If you do want to have a chat amongst yourselves throughout, please use the chat function. It is open to everyone. Samples and demos for Fit for Life are currently available. So if you're interested to see a sample, or if you want to give our new online platform, Nelson MindTap, a try, you can register. I'm going to pop the links in the chat for everyone. We are now offering 60-day trials rather than 30 days till the end of term 3. So if you've wanted to try but haven't actioned that yet, now's a good time. And if you have any questions at all, please contact us at os.secondary@cengage.com. And now I am going to pass over to Rob, and he's going to introduce Dean and get started on tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Susanna. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just introduce our keynote speaker today. It's Dr. Dean Dudley, who is a mad keen fellow of the sea and surfer. He is an associate professor at Macquarie School of Education. He's an honorary associate professor at the University of Queensland in the School of Human Movement and Nutritional Sciences. He's a general all-round nice guy, and I have the privilege of being on the same team as Dean in the Fit for Life series. It's really important we don't overlook. Dean represents Australia at UNESCO as an expert consultant, and he has been on there since 2018, and he currently is part of their International Bureau of Education. You can see there that he has done over 80 peer-reviewed publications. I know that he's actually received lots of funding in excess of the 3. It's probably closer to $4 million. And as I said, he has a genuine interest in the role that learning plays in the health and quality life of children, and as they progress through that lifelong journey. So not just whilst they're at school or at tertiary level, where Dean spends a lot of his time. So it's been a privilege to work with Dean, and I hope that you actually try and pick his brain a little bit, if not during today's session, certainly after that. He's very, very accessible. So next slide, please. So I'm really, really proud to be the series coordinator. As I said, we've got authors that have contributed to the series from all over Australia, from Queensland, from New South, Victoria, which is my home state, and West Australia. So lots and lots of great representation. I'm really excited to reconnect with Dean's meta-analysis on what makes a significant difference in the teaching of physical education. But more than that, what it does to our schools and our students in our broader communities and health and PE settings. So hopefully you'll enjoy today's presentation as well. So next one, please, as well. So the Australian curriculum 9.0, it seems like it's a long way off, but even in Victoria, where we are not mandated to actually teach it until 2025, there's lots and lots of schools that have taken it up. There's certainly a very, very strong focus, a new focus on students being physically active within their school and broader community settings. And there's a really, really strong push towards them doing so in natural and outdoor settings. And as I mentioned, we really, really want students to continue that lifelong journey, but also that sort of daily inclusion of physical activity within their lives. I've mentioned a bit about the team that I'm really, really proud to have headed up. And in the course of putting together the new series, we've actually all had to deal with COVID. And within the new series, we've actually got the most current data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, from the Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing, And also we've looked at wherever possible the impact that COVID has had, both positive and negative. So I mentioned that Dean is certainly a man of the sea and loves his surf, but no pun intended, he is going to have a really deep dive into the psychomotor, the social, emotional and cognitive skills. A lot of people call these, or refer to them as the soft skills, but I get a little bit upset because they're really, really critical skills, I think, that we can work through our students with and people who are in our care. We need students to develop those skills whilst they're under our care, so they become confident and so that their lives are as positive and as active beyond the school gates as they can possibly be. Next one, please. And I was talking to the team before today's presentation that we all teach in varied settings. 25% of students have English as an additional language. 19% of the students that we work with on average have adjusted learning tasks. And I know that in most of my classes, there are 2 or 3 students who have adjusted learning tasks. And at the other extreme, we've got students who are identified as being gifted or talented. And one of the things that I really, really love about the Fit for Life series is the ability for me as an educator to actually cater for all those students and to have them have different access points throughout the whole year that we're looking at the coursework. The new Australian curriculum, V9, basically requires adjustments in the areas that you can see: the communication, the process and communication, and also personal care, health and safety, which we'll unpack a little bit more during today's presentation. Cognitive verbs, you can be really, really proud if you are in Queensland, because you are really at the forefront, and you're going to find that your fellow educators across other states in our great country are going to make greater use of cognitive verbs within their sort of F to 10, or even in their senior curricula. I'll let some of the Cengage staff talk a little bit more about their digital platform and how, as an educator, you can really personalize your coursework to your students. So the work that I do using the Fit for Life series could be very, very different to the work that a colleague actually does a couple of kilometers down the road. So just make sure you can ask a few questions around that as well if you find that that's something that you'd like to do. A lot of people simply run with a textbook the way it's been written, but the new Cengage platform certainly allows that to be personalised. As I mentioned, those key skills, they're not soft skills, they're really, really critical life skills of cooperation, delegation, problem solving, responsibility, respect and fairness. And I know this comes out in Dean's chapter in particular, and he'll talk a little bit more. But that is sort of a thread that we've woven throughout the whole series and throughout each and every chapter. So apart from those skills, which really, really are embedded by the time students get to year 11 or their senior studies, I love the face-to-face considerations that I use as conversation starters. So before we even get into a topic, I sort of gauge where students are at in terms of prior learning and prior experiences. Throughout the teaching, or my teaching, I check in with students' wellbeing. And if you're at the last presentation, we spoke a little bit about mood mission and that student wellbeing, and also being very much an evidence-based resource that's woven throughout the whole series. There's great 2 to 3 minute grabs in the form of videos that are there to really provoke and really to get your class thinking about the topic that you might be about to embark upon. I mentioned that I spoke to a person in Queensland, a teacher in a remote and regional area, and she's going to find it difficult to do case studies. So we provided a lot of secondary data that you can actually use. If you're in metropolitan areas, obviously your students can go out and collect their own primary data and use that as part of their project-based learning or research that you might set them to do. There are tons of quizzes throughout the chapters, so you can look at pre and post coursework evaluation. So again, that feedback for, as, and of learning occurs throughout. And because it is HNPE, we do want students to be up and active as much as possible. So there's great exploration of movement skills throughout the series, and modified activities to suit your students. So I've spoken a little bit about why I love the series and hopefully why you should consider it. Today, we're going to be looking at what quality physical education is about, and Dean will unpack that. He's going to look at different evidence-based PE models, where you're going to get best bang for buck, for want of a better word, in terms of where you should be investing time and money, and more in particular, where you can find those specifically in the Fit for Life series. So thank you for your attendance today or this afternoon, and I'll hand over to Dean.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'll make a start. So as Rob briefly mentioned, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to cover these 4 areas. What is quality physical education? What are the methods we use for determining what evidence-based physical education means? Because I think that's also a term that gets thrown around fairly loosely in education now. Everyone's claiming that they've got an evidence base. I actually want to talk to you about what that means. And then talk about what the best pedagogical investments you can make in your PE practice are. And then also I'm going to talk to you about some of the ones that aren't best, just because I think it'll provide an interesting contrast about what we're led to believe works and what actually works and why. And then I'm going to spend some time pointing out to where at least 2 of those strategies are explicitly extracted in the book, in the Fit for Life series, and how you can share those experiences with your students and why they work. So let's start off with this very broad question. The idea of quality physical education as a concept is something I've been grappling with since about 2010. So whilst I was a PhD student, I was really fascinated by it. Actually, the word quality physical education never really came up in the literature really until about 2012 onwards. But in 2010, I was really wanting to bed this idea down, and I found that there were, and my thinking's changed remarkably in that time, but at that time in history, we were really talking about essentially quality physical education. Were kids learning movement skills? Were they active as a result of learning those movement skills, and did they enjoy it, right? And that's as simplistic as the argument really was at that stage. I'm happy to say that in the last 12 years, since I asked that question originally and published it in a 2010 paper in the European Physical Education Review, that the conversation's come far, far more nuanced, and it's become far, far more evidence-based. So I'm going to share something with you. So this is just a quick clip. Hopefully many of you have seen it. This was a promotional piece that we did at UNESCO in 2017. It was released in 2017 at the same time the Kazan Action Plan was. And for those of you who don't realise, in 2015, the UN ratified the International Charter for Physical Education and Sport. And it's the first time that charter had been reviewed in 38 years, which goes to show that this idea hasn't really been on the international stage well. It hasn't been articulated well. But I think this promotional piece that we shared with heads of state and ministers of education, ministers of sport, ministers of health in Kazan in 2017 really sort of set the ship sailing for what we've believed in physical education is important to us for quite some time. So I'm going to share it with you just quickly. move on. Okay, so some of you may or may not realise, so we actually put this, started to define quality physical education. It took about 3 years, and it was published in this document in 2015 by UNESCO called the Quality Physical Education Guidelines for Policymakers. And it has a fairly lengthy definition, but let's pull out the critical attributes of what you just saw in the video, but also in how internationally we define quality physical education, because I think you'll see a great deal of congruence between what you want your practice to look like and what QPE is. So the first one is we know that it's planned, progressive, and inclusive. So let's talk about that very quickly. We know, or we've experienced teachers who roll out the ball and PE, and we know what a detriment that has done to our profession, and we know what a detriment that does to the quality of our practice. So we know that it's planned and deliberate. We know that it's progressive. So, and what you'll start, I want you to keep the progressive part in your mind for a while too, please, because some of the strategies that you'll see that come out in the evidence show that progressing too quickly or too slowly are actually counterintuitive, or not meeting students where they're at, actually work against your ability to achieve a quality outcome or an efficacious outcome. And obviously inclusion. Now, this is something we've also been criticised heavily in the past, is that we tend to not deal particularly well with what we call the sick, the lame, and the lazy, and it's something that's plagued our profession. But one of the themes that definitely comes through in the quality PE agenda is this theme of inclusion for all children, where they're at. The next thing I want you to follow, and this leads into that progressive part more than everything, is that what we're doing in our class is developmentally appropriate. Now, that's interesting, right? Because curricula around the world don't often write themselves in a way that is developmentally appropriate, and then quite often it's not based on evidence. It's based on anecdote, or it's based on a national or a state agenda that we expect people to be at a certain place. But quality PE is developmentally appropriate and travels at the speed the child or the student needs. Now, this is the last bit, is what I really want to focus on. Now, unlike nearly any other subject, I mean, the closest one that would come to it might be drama or music, the performing arts, for example. But we're one of the few, and if not the primary mechanism in school that delivers or understands learning in more than one domain of learning. So when we talk about learning, we talk about holistic learning, the development of the whole child. So we talk about psychomotor development, we talk about cognitive development, we talk about social development, and we talk about emotional development. So, which leads me into this. So in physical education, and this is front and center, we don't want to fall into arguments, and the public health agenda has driven this a long way, where we exist to only deal with one discrete part of a child. So you'll see a lot of literature now saying physical education is important because it drives up academic test scores, or physical education is important because it breeds, it's important for emotional well-being, right? The fact of the matter is that what you'll see is all these things are interconnected in different ways, and every single physical educator I come across thinks that all four of these domains are as important as each other in some way. What the research that I've done is shown that you cannot apply a single approach or a single pedagogy or a single strategy and get the same level of outcome across all these domains. Furthermore, is that if we understand this as being learning, the integration of these four domains, is that we have to be very deliberate about our curriculum and our pedagogy about, well, what are we trying to achieve today? Or what is our focus for our lessons? And if our focus is a cognitive outcome or a social outcome or a psychomotor outcome, then really the onus is on us to tailor our teaching and our assessment and our school policy and climate to help us achieve the maximum yield we can in that domain towards that outcome. Well, to do that, you have to understand the evidence that would lead you to achieve outcomes the best outcome in those individual domains. And the method for doing that is we do meta-analyses. So many of you would be familiar with the work of John Hattie, who did visible learning. And if you remember John's 2009 book on visible learning, essentially what he did was, he did what is technically a meta-analysis. He looked at all the meta-analyses that had been published around the world at that time and said, these are the things that lead to student achievement. What I've done is a little bit more sophisticated and granular in terms of I've looked at the actual individual studies specific to physical education that have causal inference. So in other words, they're high quality studies that are controlled in some way. So they've been randomized controlled trials, they've been controlled trials, or they've been some sort of quasi-experimental study that has been run in a school for children K to 12. And specifically in physical education, so physical education is what has been manipulated in some way to achieve a learning and or development outcome in those students. So what did the study look like? Well, it wasn't small, to say the least. We actually located 193 individual effect sizes from 135 studies around the world. So, and that's over a 25-year span. So, yeah, it's quite a significant chunk of time. So last quarter of a century. And they weren't just from the US, Australia, and the UK either. Actually, the interventions that were applied came from 57 different, there were 57 different strategies that we were able to identify from 23 countries. So it's quite representative. It's one of the, well, it is the most representative study I've ever worked on. And what we found is within those 23 countries, in those 57 different intervention approaches, in 135 studies, we're actually capturing in excess of 42,000 students in the sample. So it's a rather large piece of evidence that we're drawing upon. So I'll give you a bit of nerdy stat stuff here. If just so you know, so the findings I'm going to present to you today, I'm going to present them in terms of effect or magnitude. So similar to what John Hattie does, I'll explain what that means. But for you to nullify those findings, so what have I got here? 135 studies. For you to say that actually the findings were not statistically significant in any way, you would have to locate 12,641 studies that showed that there was no effect. So if you want to undertake that task, be my guest. But essentially what that means is that for every positive study that we've found that makes a difference in PE, you would have to locate 66 studies that found that there was no effect. So we're talking about, in terms of causal, we're talking about a fairly robust body of literature. Okay, so how do we determine with what works? So here's a funnel plot that shows you essentially all the studies that went into our model, right? And if I point the zero, so the zero is zero effect, right? So that line, everything to the right of that line are studies that reported that what they did in PE had a positive effect on students' learning and development in one or more of the 4 learning domains that we've just discussed. Now, hopefully something's jumping out at you, right? Hopefully blind Freddie can see that looks like nearly everything that we do in PE is positive. There's very few studies that actually are touching or actually are to the left of that line, right? So what this means is that most interventions, and this was Hattie's argument that I'm extending somewhat, is that most interventions that we run in physical education have a positive effect. So this is John's argument, and one that I'm willing to borrow, is if you accept that if whatever we do is likely to have a positive effect on learning, surely we can't set the point of declaring victory at anything greater than 0, right? Because if most things have a positive effect, surely we want to get to a point with things that have the most effect. And we know, especially in PE, probably more so than any other subject area, excluding maybe the arts and music and drama, they might fall in the category as well, is that our time is really limited and that we're the first thing on the chopping block. Not to mention, unlike drama and music and visual arts, is we have, in my early PhD work and my master's studies looked at this, I observe up to 30% of our time being wasted just on things that have nothing to do with learning. Kids getting changed, moving to and from class, getting unchanged, right? All these things are action. Imagine if mathematics lost 30% of their teaching time, like every lesson. There would be royal commissions into that. But in PE, it's just what we do. So for me, the emphasis on that limited time that we do have those kids in front of us, we've got to make sure that it's more than just zero is our effect. So much so, I can show you this will less than 7% of the studies actually made kids go backwards. Right, so you hear a lot of anecdote in schools saying, "Oh, you guys don't achieve anything." Well, I hate to say it, even the teachers who don't achieve much achieve positive effects on most days, right? So let's have a conversation about what has the most effect. All right, and that no single approach is going to work in any one domain. This slide I found absolutely fascinating. So many of you would have come across John's work. There's the book, Visible Learning. Sorry, Cengage, it's from another publisher, but that book is one of the best sold books on education around the world. And John argues that in terms of, if you say student achievement is synonymous with learning, he says, of all the studies ever done on it and anything we've ever done in schools and teachers and with parents and so forth, the average effect size is 0.4 of a standard deviation, right? So he says anything less than 0.4 is underachieving, and really, because we've got limited time in schools, we should argue, or we should try and do things in schools that are 0.4 or above from the evidence, because they're in the zone of desired effects. So I was wondering whether PE would be any different. So if you think about, but we don't think of learning more than just achievement scores, right? So we think of, remember, go back to that first slide, we think of learning as holistic. So if we think of learning as being an integration of cognitive, psychomotor, social, and affective or emotional learning, and that's our outcome. So what effect does PE or do PE strategies have on holistic learning of child? This will blow you away. It's 0.4 of a standard deviation, right? When you do the statistical adjustment for error. And the first thing I did when I published this study and I found that number, I actually texted John Hattie and said, "You're not going to believe this." There's just this weird twist of fate that it's exactly the same standard deviation. So the thing is, though, and this is what I want you to be conscious of, it's not 0.4 in every domain, right? So like I said at the beginning, it's 0.4 if you think about it holistically. So if you were just interested in learning, you might try and actively target strategies that always are consistently a point above 0.4. However, PE does certain or caters to certain domains of learning more than others. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. And I think we need to be a little bit humbled by it too. So I'm going to show you the smallest to the largest. The smallest domain we have impact on, so where the best investments lie, are domain specific. So when we look at the cognitive domain, the thinking skills that kids acquire, that's our smallest impact. And so much so is that the average of all the interventions that we've run in PE, the average effect size is 0.17 of a standard deviation. This is considered small to negligible to small. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. So in other meta-analyses that have been done, is that physical activity breaks and school sport and being active has about the same effect size, between about 0.12 and about 0.2 of a standard deviation, is the average effect size for any physical activity-based intervention that tries to drive cognition. So you've probably all seen those Chuck Hillman brain scans and all that stuff, and getting kids to run a mile before they sit an exam, right? all that stuff. Yeah, it's not cognitively demanding. It does have some small, really small negligible impacts. But I want to show you there is at least one thing that we do well that sits well above 0.7. And that's when we use games-based approaches. Now, think about why that might work. When we use games-based approaches in our teaching, but I'm talking about explicit games-based pedagogies like teaching games for understanding, game sense approach, play practice, the tactical games approaches. Those approaches work because we actively engage kids in questions to solve problems. Why did you pass here? Where should you be standing? What's your next move? What's the tactic you're going to employ? What strategy you're going to play when you next play this game? The reason we get such a high effect size, almost close to that 0.4 when we do those deliberate games-based approaches, is because we require kids to think, right? And then we connect their brain to their body when they go and do the activity. So games-based approaches, when done with high degree of fidelity, have very, very good, more than double the effect size of the average. But have a look at this. Have a look at the weaker bets. So just increasing the number of getting kids to do more PE is lower than the average. It's 0.1 of a standard deviation, right? And by the way, I should say that where I've got these averages from, there had to be 3 or more studies, and this is the average of 3 or more studies in those domains. Here's the other one, is that, so we've heard a lot of people that bang on about health-based physical activity. It's all about getting kids active or getting 50% of moderate to vigorous physical activity in every lesson, and that'll drive up their test scores. Yeah, it will, by 0.06 of a standard deviation if you do it in PE. It's tiny, almost negligible. So it's got to be more than just the activity and thinking that their legs and their arms moving is going to connect to their brain and they're going to solve problems, right? The problem solving has to be inbuilt. And some of the fitness-based strategies, guess what? They went backwards, which is a little bit concerning. So when we've got fitness testing-based PE, that tends to, in terms of cognitive problem solving, doesn't tend to be a particularly good strategy. So that's our weakest domain. The next one is our social domain. And this is by far the most under-researched aspect of it. And this is something we've sort of hung our hat on. You know, we build social skills in PE. Well, you know what? We actually don't have a lot of evidence that we do this particularly well. It's almost like it's achieved through osmosis. But what I will say is that the average effect size of the studies that have been done, and there's a ton of different strategies with little consistency. But the average effect size is about 0.32 of the standard deviation. So it's actually rising quite quick. And compared to other strategies that schools do to promote social learning, PE is a particularly strong strategy. Specifically is the cooperative learning strategy, right? Where kids sink or swim on their ability to work as a team to get through the problem. So if you want to read some really good stuff on cooperative learning, there's authors like Ben Dyson, Ash Casey from the UK, Vicky Goodyear, who have done a whole bunch of stuff about what cooperative learning looks like in a model in PE. And that's actually a little bit stronger. It's about 0.42 of the standard deviation. I really can't make any judgments on all the studies that sit below the average because they haven't been replicated more than twice. So I'm a bit reluctant to draw or name and shame anyone below that line. Suffice to say, it makes sense, right? When we deliberately focus on kids having to cooperate and solve problems together to get through the class or to be successful, you have to put the social emphasis on their ability to sink or swim. Cooperative learning makes that very explicit, which is why it works. The next one is the affective, the emotional domain. What drives and motivates kids to learn? We do particularly well here. And there's been a lot of good studies about how, especially out of the UK and the US, about using PE to keep kids in school, right? And motivate. It's good, eh? You know the kids that will come to school because they've got PE today. I've never heard a kid say, can't wait to go to school today because I've got that plan. They'll say, I can't wait to go to school today. I've got PE or I've got drama or I've got music, because these are the things that enrich us emotionally. They give us purpose. And PE is a particularly strong motivator for learning more broadly. But it's a two-edged sword. So look at this. What this has kind of gone out of vogue and it drives me nuts, is that there was a lot of work done on the target pedagogy back in the 90s. It was written by a gentleman called Epstein, or it was written by Epstein. And Epstein, target stands for, having a task, design the activities, where the authority resided, recognition and how you use rewards, grouping, evaluation, and then the pace of the instruction. But it's largely underpinned not only by having students have some authority in the modeling, it's also built on a model of mastery teaching. You don't allow kids to progress until they've achieved sufficient competence to be challenged with a more difficult task, right? So quite often we accelerate through our programs so rapidly as if you fall behind, a bit like a kid in a maths class, they feel like they're lost forever. And Sue Harter used to talk about competency motivation theory, that we needed competence, and when we achieve competence, it motivated us to become more competent and challenge that competence. And it kind of went out of vogue in favor of things like self-determination theory and all those other, that sort of took over. Everyone talks about STD and Ryan and Decky, but what we see in the pedagogical models is competent, actually not letting kids proceed until they've acquired some mastery works, and we shouldn't be scared to use it. Obviously, giving kids some autonomy and choice, kids in terms of motivation, that is a real driving force. And I think you can mix mastery teaching and autonomy together in some interesting ways. But the one that really jumps out to me, I know it's 0.67, and we're going to talk about a little bit later, is sport education. So this is a Darryl Seidentop model. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit depth because we explore it in a bit of depth. And you're going to see it again, right? We explore it in depth in the Fit for Life. Some of the weaker bets, again, fitness-based PE. Interesting, TGFU, and I think teaching aids for understanding, I think it's still rather high, right? It's above the average at 0.45. So I wouldn't be scared to use either fitness-based PE or TGFU, but it tends to be just below, and it's only just below the threshold. I think the cognitive taxing nature of TGFU probably can wane on kids' motivation because they do have to think hard, and thinking is tough exercise. But whilst I put it in the weakest bets, I would still be prepared to use both of those to drive effective learning because they're above the average of 0.4. However, getting the kids active for getting active sake at 0.1, it's not motivating kids, right? When we drive health, physical activity guidelines into them and say, okay, you've just got to do this because you've got to meet the guidelines, or it's about being, 50% MVPA in lessons, it's just not catering to their affective and emotional learning needs, not to the degree it needs to be. And finally, we shouldn't be surprised if we didn't do particularly well in the psychomotor learning domain, we're in the wrong job. Now, over half a standard deviation is the average. That means that this is highly visible difference. You will be able to tell the difference between a PE teacher running explicit psychomotor targeted learning. You will see a visible difference in the motor development of the kids in the two classrooms to the naked eye. And you don't even need to be an expert. That's how big this effect size is. So where did the mastery, look at this, target again, it's there again, right? And I can promise you in my new book that we're going to be exploring this in much more detail after this study, my tertiary book. But again, sport education's up there. So it's crossing two domains, right? Which is why I want to talk about it. And it's rather high. The thing with the sport education model too, it doesn't have a high degree of explicit teaching in it. What I think it is, I think it's a model that integrates social, affective, and psychomotor learning particularly well. And it has a multiplier effect. The social domain hasn't been measured adequately enough for me to report on sport education. But what I can tell you is that I think one study that looked at social learning, sport education did particularly well there as well. Obviously, increasing PE frequency is going to have an impact on psychomotor development. If they do stuff more often, that's going to develop. So we shouldn't be surprised. Again, games-based pedagogy. So connecting the mind to the body and having them question. So connecting their thinking with how and why they're moving. And that development is particularly strong. And fitness-infused activity PE also has a strong effect size. I'm really not surprised about that because I think it becomes a physiological adaptation. As we become fitter, we can do more, we can throw longer, we can do it more frequently. So it's more a physiological adaptation rather than a learning adaptation. And here's the other one. Look, those health-based physical activity promoting PE models, again, they're rather low, 0.3. So I want to talk, that's the evidence in a nutshell across the board. Now, there's a little bit of difference at the primary and at the secondary level, but it's what I present today fits fairly consistently, especially with the secondary model. So where do you find them in Fit for Life? So this is the chapter that I wrote in Fit for Life, chapter 8, Playing the Game, Being Good Sport. And it explicitly targets two of the strategies that I just spoke to that cross two of those domains. Namely, the first one, here's the chapter overview, talks about different types, what it takes to, if you look down here, identify the characteristics of an enthusiastic and confident sports person, and understand the significance of games in cultures and solve strategic and tactical problems. So the first one is sport education. So if you haven't read about it, please do. It's in the book. It's really about the celebration as sport as a genre of movement, and understanding that kids need to understand sport more than just from a player perspective, right? They have to understand that sport just doesn't happen. You need people to referee and keep score, and to coach and to captain and to manage and to train and to cheer, and there's a culture of sport, and each sport carries a unique culture about it, and understanding it and being able to participate in it actually, one, deepens your understanding, but also deepens your appreciation of being involved in it. And as we know, and as we age, it gets to a point where playing team sports especially becomes increasingly more difficult. But moving into coaching roles and officiating roles, they're as legitimate, sometimes even more so legitimate as we go through it. So sport education in the unit gets kids to do everything from design their jerseys, to work through each of these roles, to create team songs, and really feed into the social aspects, which I didn't report, but I know that it does have a good effect size. So this affective, this motivation to learn flourishes, and they develop skills concurrently. And the good thing about sport education, what you can do as a practitioner is you have to become a very strong architect of the learning environment, but it gives you really poignant points of intervention. So you can let teams work together when they're doing well, identify when teams are stalling in their learning or breaking through the problems, and be very targeted in your feedback. We include really random case studies. And reason this is important, we use Quidditch here, and I'll tell you the danger in the sport education literature and why I've used a case study like Quidditch is quite often the trap that teachers fall into with sport education is if I say we're going to do a sport education on netball, it carries a gender bias. All the boys go, oh, I don't want to play netball, it's a girls' game. Or if it's going to be rugby, oh, that's a boys' game, sir. So trying to pick really gender neutral kind of activities or stuff that they haven't experienced that doesn't carry that baggage allows the role differentiation to carry less of a gender power base. So I use Quidditch as a good example, and something that take you a little bit out of your comfort zone and learn with the kids too. It's lots of fun. In terms of the effective games-based pedagogy, so I very much use the games classification system, which spawns out of the Teaching Games for Understanding literature, to really break down each of the games classifications, how you learn them, the problems you need to solve, how to get feedback from both the teacher and from your students, and ask them remember I said that really drives the cognitive domain, and ask them tough questions. And it then gives them case studies that are non-typical. I doubt you'll have more than one child, if you're lucky, that even understands what crawl is. But the problems that they're asked to solve in this really amazingly athletic sport can be taught in kindergarten. And I do teach it with kindies with a balloon. But what's fascinating about it is that you can show them these games. They draw on a range of skills that they've learned elsewhere. And they understand that the problems that they're trying to solve are transferable. And that's really the critical aspect of the Teaching Games for Understanding pedagogy and these deliberate cognitive focused games-based pedagogies. And we include really detailed descriptions, questions that need to be asked, questions that need to be solved, and then how you modify your activity as those skills become more apt at solving the problem. That's it from me. I probably went a little bit over time, but thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions at the end. Thanks very much.
Okay, hi, I'm Amanda. I'm one of the learning consultants from Nelson, and I'm just going to talk to you quickly about Nelson MindTap, our new courseware. So as you can see, these are our covers, and we'll start talking about Nelson MindTap. So Nelson MindTap is an online learning space where teachers and students access rich content and assignments in a simple integrated user experience. Next slide, please. As you can see from the infinity diagram, Nelson MindTap is an online learning space that puts you, the teacher, and the student at the centre. Next slide. Nelson MindTap offers course customisation. With the rich online materials, you can create your own course based on the school's topic selections, sequences, and priorities. You can customise how you'd like to teach the course. As a teacher, you can tailor the modular lesson content for different needs. You have the ability to hide content and reveal it when you're ready to teach. You can add links of your own and create your own content and bring it into the learning pathway. And then when you're ready, you can publish your course and assign it to the class or to individual students. Next slide, thanks. We also offer throughout the text, modified text. This enhances the understanding, and with read speaker text to speech technology, this assists in catering for differentiated needs, along with keyword definitions that are highlighted throughout the text in the right place throughout the text at the right time. Nelson MindTap courseware can be accessed anytime, anywhere, with an immersive and interactive e-text. Students and teachers can personalise their e-text with the use of things like bookmarks, highlighting, making notes, and save it all into the study hub for later revision. All of this is designed to engage your students and save you time and preparation. Next slide. We also have a great feature called Gradebook. So all of the assessment within Nelson MindTap courseware feeds into Gradebook, which gives you real-time usage and analytics. Students can track their own progress with learning with immediate feedback from the quizzes. And for the teacher, you have access to powerful student and class analytics and data that will save you time. There are pre and post section quizzes provided that allow you to have formative assessment opportunities. And there's also, you can differentiate the instructions by creating groups and assigning things to the whole class, to a group, or to an individual student. With full admin access to your whole class, you can easily create and edit all of these groups. Next slide. Price and availability. So as you can see, all of the books will be out by November, with one of the workbooks just coming at the beginning of December. We will have the print book, which is $70.95. That includes access to the Nelson MindTap courseware. We also have a print-only workbook at $31.95. There is also a value pack. It's a print value pack with your student book, workbook, and your access to Nelson MindTap courseware. And then also there is a digital-only option, which runs for 26 months for $49.95. Access to the Nelson MindTap courseware for teachers is complimentary when a school purchases a class set or book lists the text or the Nelson MindTap digital offering as the core text in the subject. When you adopt the course, we work with you to set up the course, and then you can invite your students to the course with a unique course key. We offer full teacher training and are only too happy to arrange this well before the books are due for any adopting schools. Next slide. We'd also like to offer participants a trial. We had been offering a 30-day trial. We have now extended that to a 60-day trial for the rest of this term, taking in obviously that we've got school holidays coming up. So if you'd like to have a great opportunity to have a look over our Nelson MindTap courseware, or if you'd like to preview our uncorrected page proofs, if you haven't already seen them, please contact us at os.secondary@cengage.com and someone will contact you. I'd like to thank both both Dean and Rob for their presentation tonight. It was wonderful. And if anyone's got any questions, now's the time to start typing. Thanks.
We will stay on the line maybe for a couple minutes just to see if any questions come through. I'd like to say massive thank you again to all our presenters tonight. I'm learning that we might need a Nelson Secondary Quidditch team to get us going, but we'll just hold off for a couple more minutes, and then if there is no questions, we can finish up. Maybe we'll give it one more minute. Don't see anything coming through, so now the Q&A and the chat are open if you wanted to use either to post any questions. We will have a little bit of a look. Got a quiet bunch. Right. It's great. If you have a trial, that's fantastic. Hopefully trials will be extended. Might pass that one on to Amanda. If you would like to extend your trial, please contact us at os.secondary.com. I'll pop the email into the chat now, and then we can talk about getting that extended just so over the school holidays. But if there are no more questions, I want to say a massive thank you again to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to all our presenters. I am going to stop recording. This recording